What are the three key questions surrounding the 2023 New Orleans Saints for fantasy football? It's time to break it down right here and right now as we begin another edition of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Vinnie Iyer. I'm not doing this. I'm writing about NFL and fantasy football for sportingnews.com. We're looking at all the storylines of the offseason, tracking the running back contracts that could be up here soon that we look at. Saquon Barkley, Tony Pollard, Josh Jacobs all playing under the franchise tag. Will Barkley and Jacobs be happy with that? It seems like Tony Pollard is. So looking at those players as well as the free agent running backs still available, including Dalvin Cook and Ezekiel Elliott. You can check that out there at sportingnews.com. Here at Locked On Fantasy Football, we continue our series of key questions, asking them of all 32 teams when it comes to fantasy football for 2023. We're deep into our third division. That's the NFC South. If you missed any of the analysis of the teams in the NFC East and NFC North, you can check those out. But we're down to the New Orleans Saints now, so penultimate team we're talking about in the South. So we also broke down for you the Falcons and Panthers. That means that in our next show, we'll look at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers without Tom Brady to close this week. So a lot of good stuff to ask about the Saints, including Alvin Kamara, Derek CarR, their new starting quarterback, and Chris Olave, their very exciting young wide receiver. So those are the things we'll focus on today's show, breaking down those potential values for fantasy football. And first, we got to tell you, thanks for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen today. We're free and available to you wherever you get your podcasts, and we really appreciate you checking us out every day. And again, on deck is the Buccaneers. If you missed any of this series, it's up on our archives wherever you get your podcasts. It's YouTube and audio forms as well. All right. Let's dive right into the number one question. What is Alvin Kamara's status with the Saints here? Can he still be trusted even as an RB2 in fantasy? Well, let's look at where Alvin Kamara was last year. Finished as RB18 in half-point PPR scoring. That's what we used for our model here. He also was 17th in average points per game in fantasy, so pretty comparable there with what he did. So another pretty good year for him. He had 77 targets, caught 57, so that's a lower number in general for him. 490 yards there and 2 touchdowns through the air. 223 carries, 897 yards, so just falls short of 900 yards and 4 TDs. So not a lot of TDs. He's been a big TD guy in the past and has exploded in that capacity, but not a lot there. Struggled a little bit with the workload and is a little cloud hanging over him off the field. We'll see what that Pro Bowl incident brings here. So suspension still potentially in the works for Kamara, and that's the biggest concern here. Now, his wide range of ranking outcomes in half-point PPR, some experts have him still as high as RB21, a few spots lower than where he finished last year. Some have buried him all the way to RB31, and his evening off point is actually lower at RB30. So there's a lot of concerns about his availability for sure. That's what that reflects. And they also made some moves here to maybe change the course of this backfield. Jamal Williams coming over after his big scoring season with the Lions. He signs. They move on from Mark Ingram. This is a team that has vacated 88 carries and 111 running back touches from last year overall. Ingram, we know, wasn't a big part of the passing game, but he had 62 carries versus 16 looks there in the passing game. You also lose some other guys, David Johnson, Latavius Murray, Tony Jones Jr., Jordan Howard. These guys were all in this backfield mix last year with Kamara. And Dwayne Washington, he returns, but you see this backfield now. Jamal Williams is the newcomer, as well as the rookie Kendre Miller from TCU. So 2 new backs to replace essentially all those guys. When you look at it, 5 guys when you count Ingram, Johnson, Murray, Jones, and Howard. And you can't forget about Taysom Hill, who had 90 6 rush attempts last year, big part of their rushing attack, 105 overall touches. So he's back. So you got to worry about him for Alvin Kamara. That definitely hurt Kamara's value overall last year, the usage of Taysom Hill. That's not going to totally go away, right? I know it's a little bit different now with Derek Carr at quarterback, and it's not going to be what we look at the situation as usual with Taysom Hill getting the wrinkle carries. But when you look at 88 carries, 111 touches, those can be easily swallowed up by Williams, Miller there to break that up, and maybe a little bit more in the works here to get those additional touches. So I don't think you'll see necessarily 200 locking in for Alvin Kamara in terms of carries, because again, Williams is that guy. So you could see him at more 150. The goal is, will he get 100 targets here to really make up for that fact? Is he going to score a lot? We know Williams is going to cut into the scoring quite a bit. Kennedy Miller could cut into different areas of Alvin Kamara's work. So I think there's reason to be worried here. It's interesting where the industry ranks him. He's way down there as a RB3, so flex play. But look at the people ranked ahead of him: Miles Sanders, Dameon Pierce. We do like Sanders in that role, but Pierce a little bit questionable with Devin Singletary. Cam Akers, you can't trust him totally with the Rams. Dalvin Cook, as a free agent, is ranked higher than Alvin Kamara. James Conner in a steady role. Rachaad White makes sense there. DeAndre Swift, even with the battle with Rashad Penny in Philadelphia, is up there. Isaiah Pacheco, that totally makes sense. David Montgomery, a little bit shaky there behind Jahmyr Gibbs. Alexander Madison still going up there outside as an RB3 with Cook gone, but still worried about touches from Ty Chandler and the like. And Javonte Williams. All these people are ranked higher than Alvin Kamara. Javonte's injury concern is what buries him a little bit, but he would be way up there as well once we had some clearance. So Alvin Kamara pretty much buried there as a top flex play, which is unusual, right? He's been pretty reliable for most of his career because of his receiving prowess, especially in half point, full point PPR as a RB1. He fell off to RB2, but still pretty solid, right? Mid-range there. I don't know if he's reliable even as an RB2 this year. That's answering the question. Well, we look at it, Jamal Williams, again, big scoring threat, maybe underrated as a receiver. Kendrick Miller can do a little bit of everything. He'll be involved. They should also be less reliant on throwing the running backs. The Raiders really didn't do that a lot with Derek Carr. Jacobs was involved quite a bit, but it was still throwing downfield. So Carr can keep them away from the dink and dunk game that we've seen with Andy Dalton and Jameis Winston. So a very interesting situation here developing for Kamara, and it's all not good. And then you throw in the suspension. We're just not sure when it's going to come down, when you might lose him for multiple games. So Williams was a plus signing, and it really opens the door for Kendrick Miller when Kamara's out to have a big role here behind the veteran Williams. So a lot to watch out there with Kamara, a lot of red flags that you want to be careful. I think it does make sense to draft him outside of the RB2s in this particular season, whatever you're looking at, half point, full point as well here in fantasy football leagues. All right, that's one key question down. It wasn't positive there with Alvin Kamara, just not high on him at all. The industry kind of feels the same, and I think they're right on there. We will ask the key question about Chris Olave, which the industry is more excited about. Let's just say that. I think it's unlimited there what Olave could do in year two. So we'll break him down in our second segment here on Locked On Fantasy Football. We do know that it is over in the NBA. The Denver Nuggets won the championship. We also had the hockey come to a close here with Stanley Cup champion Las Vegas Golden Knights there. So you have two new franchises on top, but there's still plenty of action you can get in on. Baseball season is in full swing, and you can find that at number one sportsbook in America. That's FanDuel Sportsbook. Make your way to FanDuel, because right now new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. So it's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. They really take care of you there at FanDuel. They're going to bring new promotions to get you in the game. Baseball might be a little bit challenging to you, but they're going to ease you in there, and a lot of big matchups coming up. We have the All-Star break, and then things are just going to heat up all around MLB. Some surprises definitely in the first half, including the Texas Rangers, Tampa Bay Rays having such a great start there. So a lot of things you can look at with the baseball and futures, of course, as well. Now we're in futures mode for NBA, NHL, NFL, so check it out. And you can also look at some parlays that are interesting as well at this time of year at FanDuel Sportsbook. With FanDuel Sportsbook, you can be insured with a safe and secure app. So you know your bets are being placed securely. And when you win those bets, you'll get paid instantly, seeing that money deposit right in your account. There's no better place to bet on all the action than at America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel. And all you have to do is go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA and a proud sponsor here of Locked On Fantasy Football. All right, it is time to continue the show here on Locked On Fantasy Football. We're looking at the New Orleans Saints. Thanks again for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. Every day is our next show. We will have 4 shows a week here for a while. It's nice and convenient to break down divisions and the key questions. So we'll have the Buccaneers up here to close the week on our next show. So looking forward to that. We're part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, your fantasy football team every day. All right, let's ask the question, is Chris Olave worth the hype in fantasy football? Well, let's look at where he was as a rookie, shall we? First, he was ranked wide receiver 25. That's overall scoring. In terms of average half-point PPR scoring, wide receiver 26. He had 119 targets, a healthy number, caught 72, 1,042 yards, and 4 TDs. Those are actually modest numbers. He's ranked right now as wide receiver 13. The Saints, the middle of the pack with 127 vacated targets. A lot of that coming from 2 guys, Jarvis Landry and Marquez Callaway, 70 targets there. The rest kind of really trickling down, and you have Adam Troutman, the tight end. He was traded to the Broncos. He had 28 targets, and Mark Ingram, we mentioned, had 12 targets. So those are where 110 of those targets are between Landry, Callaway, Troutman, and Ingram. And you look at Michael Thomas. Will he be more involved here? He's already got an injury issue. He was a pretty good scorer when he was on the field, but then it really fell off for him here. And you look at Thomas's ranking. He's wide receiver 48. And Rashid Shaheed, made some big plays last year as the number 3. He's wide receiver 67. So Thomas, the last wide receiver 4 on the board, and Shaheed buried as a wide receiver 6. So there's a lot of anticipation. Chris Olave is going to dominate targets. That's why you see him bump up about 12 to 13 spots. They're up to wide receiver 13. So that puts him as borderline wide receiver 1 and half-point PPR. That's a top 12 guy. So why do we like Chris Olave so much? Well, the air yards were talked about a lot last year, 1,531 air yards. So that was the potential he had. Unfortunately, he had Jameis Winston and Andy Dalton throwing to him. 25% target share is very healthy as a rookie. Just looks the part, right? Clean route runner, number 1 guy all over the field. I think Derek CarR is going to trust him, and CarR is going to really be an upgrade for him because he tends to hook onto one guy. We've seen with Darren Waller or Hunter Renfrow, and there's not a lot, right? You really have a drop-off. You go Thomas Shaheed, and then there's nothing at wide receiver. You got to look at Juwan Johnson at tight end to give you some value next that you would be relying upon here with Derek CarR. So you could very much see that where Chris Olave is Hunter Renfrow, but way up there. And we know that going into the past, Derek CarR came up with Amari Cooper. He made him the go-to guy. They dominated. Michael Crabtree had a big time there with CarR. So CarR's going to take care of his key weapons. So I think those guys are really going to be Olave and Johnson. I look at Thomas just fading more and more. Those injuries just make him totally unreliable. Olave has to act as the number 1. There's no way he scores 4 TDs or fewer this year. It's going to go up. I mean, that's a very modest also receiving total for the volume he got. I think he's going to push towards 130, 140 targets. You should see his catches push past 90, and his yardage going to like 1,200 or 1,300. So everything goes up. The big play potential is also up because we know about the air yards. Derek CarR, underrated as a big play passer, and he's going to throw to guys that scheme themselves open well. And CarR doesn't take a lot of chances. He just likes guys who are going to get open. And Chris Olave does that everywhere. He separates. He gets downfield. CarR is going to love throwing to this guy as his number 1. So everything bumps up here. The Saints are a passing team about 60% to 55, that kind of thing when you look at it. So they still want to throw the ball a little bit more. It's a little bit of a change in their offensive direction, but again, they have to throw more out of necessity because their defense has lost more. So I think you'll see them bump up a little bit. That's going to help Olave with the targets and the production as well. So everything is true for Chris Olave. There's nothing where you say, oh, is there anything we should doubt here? It's much like Garrett Wilson, right, with Aaron Rodgers and the Jets. It's a pretty sure thing here. And just a talent. And you start with the talent alone. Olave and Wilson have oodles of it. They're pretty much the same type of receiver here. Olave now has a dedicated, capable quarterback who can feed him really well. That's going to help. So everything pointing upward for Chris Olave. He's not going to disappoint. And maybe we're still selling him short as outside of the top 12. That's how good of a season I think Olave can have in New Orleans in year 2. All right, there you have a breakdown of the second key question involving the number 1 receiver, unquestioned guy in New Orleans. We'll ask about his quarterback. What does this mean for Derek Carr? Can he deliver and bring about more scoring than his particular rank and standing? We'll look at that in our final segment here on Locked On Fantasy Football. Again, subscribe and follow for free wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for making us your first listen. And every day we're bringing you stuff all throughout the offseason as well. Might be a few days less here in June as we kind of rest up a little bit for the season, but we're still giving the insight you need. So we'll be done here this week with our third division, and then closing on the last NFC division, we'll look at the NFC West from the Arizona Cardinals all the way down to the Seattle Seahawks. So looking forward to that division and breaking things down for you next week there after we finish up with the Buccaneers and the show with the Saints with our key question series for all 32 teams. All right, it is time to close the show and look at the big quarterback question. Derek Carr. Are we sleeping on Derek Carr? Is he going to get above where he usually is and give us a viable fantasy football production that we really like? Well, this is an interesting stat there for Derek Carr. Look at his finishes when you go back to 2017 with the Raiders in quarterback scoring: 19th, 18th, 17th, 14th, 12th, 17th. So he had one spike into the borderline and the end of the QB1s. Let's look at him where he was again last year. Well, he was QB 17 in terms of overall scoring, but he was ranked QB 20 there in terms of the average scoring, and that's where he is right now. He's stuck at QB 20. Now, this might seem weird as he transitions that he's right where he was at the end of last year, especially with the Raiders being such a run-heavy team. Josh Jacobs won the rushing title. So you figure that there's a little bit of similar profile with the Saints, but he'll need to throw more. But look at these numbers for Derek Carr. Look at the numbers that you had with Dalton and Winston last year. 3,522 yards passing, so that's modest when you have well less than 4,000, and that's usually been reliable for Carr. That was a big difference in the drop-off of 5 spots. 24 TDs only, 14 interceptions. That is a pretty high number for him. And only 102 yards rushing, so you're not going to get anything there. But look at Dalton and Winston. Pretty high, right? You had a little bit of Taysom Hill and all that stuff, but they were right around 3,700 yards passing with 24 TDs. Sound familiar? And 14 interceptions. And actually, Andy Dalton was a decent runner to put up some numbers there. But we know overall, Carr is not going to run. So you look at the numbers, they're very parallel. He's pretty much taking over for this team. Now, they expect an upgrade. I think they might be a little bit disappointed that Carr is not a wins above replacement significant factor here over Winston Dalton. I think he's a fine quarterback, and he had some stability where they're not starting multiple guys or trying to force Taysom Hill in there in kind of wrinkle situations. Hill can just be a dynamic runner to help them a little bit more. So that all lines up. I think overall the Saints are a better running team than the Raiders, even though Jacobs had the year. Their offensive line is fantastic. They do have a slightly worse defense, but the Raiders were still worse than what the Saints are right now. And there's not a lot, right? And when you look at the numbers, what do you have behind Chris Olave, Alvin Kamara, and Juwan Johnson? I mean, Thomas Shaheed, not the best receivers there. Kamara's volume could go down in terms of targets. So you're not looking at a lot beyond Olave, and that's why we like Olave, because he can dominate the targets from Carr and put up some numbers based on that. But in terms of Carr finding other guys to go that way, it's tough. Another pro in Derek Carr's favor is the schedule being very favorable. But I look at this, and again, I don't think this is the best situation. Again, his history says he's not going to put up the big numbers. He's pretty steady with what he does. He has an outside shot at 30 TDs, but unlikely to get there. He's probably 22 to 26 type TD guy anyway. Here, right when you look at the 24 as a number here, so it's just not a guy that you're going to trust. I think he'll have some value in certain matchups there as a streamer or a backup, but I don't want Derek Carr in a starting lineup unless the matchup is good or my regular starter is hurt. I just don't want it here. I just think he could be a disappointment as he makes the transition here out of Josh McDaniels' offense. I don't think he fit very well in that. I think he'll struggle a little bit in the Saints offense in the transition. So again, he's a pretty decent reality player and a good reminder that reality quarterback a lot different the way you get paid and the way you're perceived in reality versus the way you are in fantasy. And Derek Carr has never been all that exciting in fantasy because he doesn't have the running upside. He's got a pretty limited ceiling, and his floor is not always high either. So that's what we examine here with Derek Carr. But yeah, I don't want any part of Derek Carr at all unless I'm streaming or you have a devastating injury and I need to add some depth. I'm just not going to go there this season with Derek Carr in the rankings. I don't need to. There's a lot on the board, as we've talked about, the deep sleepers there in fantasy that you can target. So there you have it. There's a look at the 2020 New Orleans Saints, the 3 key fantasy football questions that we want answers for and are trying to shed light on here ahead of training camp. Don't forget, we will look at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers next to close out this week with the spotlight of the NFC South and the key questions there. Next week, we'll close it all with the NFC, get halfway home with all our breakdowns of all 32 teams with the NFC West as well. So good stuff coming, good stuff in the past. If you missed anything here, Locked On Fantasy Football, we're going to dominate and help you dominate as well with your offseason and in-season knowledge and insight for fantasy football. So we're here to help. We're here to help you have the best fantasy football team, whether you're playing year-long or DFS. Stick with us here. And thanks again if you're an everyday listener. If you're a new listener, welcome. And we'll take you on this journey all through the season. So looking forward to that. For Locked On Fantasy Football, it's Vinnie Iyer. And have a great day. And we'll check you out to close the week looking at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers.